Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's KISS webinar. My name is Chris Patel, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Mike Green and Harley Bassman, who's currently in Ireland. I think he's having a little bit of technical difficulty, so we'll get him back on here as soon as possible. Today's webinar is with Neil Howe, a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Global Aging Institute. Neil is a renowned historian, economist, demographer, and prolific author with over a dozen books gaining worldwide notoriety for his publication of Generations in 1991, with co-author William Strauss, and coining the term millennial generation. Neil's insights are regularly featured in major media outlets, including the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, and 60 Minutes. With the New York Times bestselling book, The Fourth Turning is Here, Neil leverages historical patterns to offer a compelling and hopeful prophecy for resolving the present era of civil unrest over the next decade. His educational background includes a BA from UC Berkeley and graduate degrees in economics and history from Yale University. And before I hand it off to Mike and Harley, please remember that today's presentation is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. As we go through the presentation, feel free to put some questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to those as we go through the presentation. And with that, Mike, I will hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. Neil, great to see you.
See you again, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I've got my partner Harley Bassman with us here.
Okay.
Hey, baby.
So we are, there have been few books, I think, that have captured the kind of public attention, or at least, the investment world's attention in terms of prophecy and outlook than your book, The Fourth Turning, and before that, obviously, Generations. Every time we encounter challenges over the past kind of 20 years, I hear the refrain, the fourth turning is here. This is what we should expect. And now your latest book, The Fourth Turning is Here, is kind of your confirmation that these are the events that we have talked about for an extended period of time. You think this is it? You think we're here at this point, right?
Yes. In fact, we've been in it for a while.
Okay.
I would sort of date our entry into this winter season of history, thinking of history as seasonal, to the GFC, 2007, 2008, which was about when we expected it, way back in 1997. And we still have about a decade to go. And as usual, it gets more exciting and more interesting as you move toward the end of the fourth turning, or toward the climax, right? It's interesting though, Michael, the reception of the two books. When we came out with The Fourth Turning back in 1997, the reaction was, well, that's kind of interesting. It's way out there. It sounds kind of gloomy. It's sort of pessimistic. It's kind of a doomsday book way out there. The reception to this book, when it came out last year, first of all, it sold a lot better right off the gate. But the other thing is that it was a very different reception. Everyone said, how can you be so optimistic? I mean, isn't this a decline without end? So the very fact that we say, no, this too will end, we will enter a first turning, which is a time of very close community, firmer, more trusted institutions, greater equality, particularly in our economic life, wealth and income, a more conventional culture, and a greater dedication toward long-term future. We have always found that in first turnings. That's kind of the post-crisis era. And like every other era, it's a response to the one that comes before it. So we've been here before. When you think that history is linear up, talking about cycles is always very pessimistic. But when you think that history is linear down, which is the way a lot of people do today, talking about cycles becomes a little bit more upbeat. You know what I mean?
I totally agree with you. I think that's one of the things that I find so interesting. And candidly, I'm rethinking some of my impressions in the context of some of your work, particularly around the millennial generation. I'm looking at them with kind of a newfound appreciation for the components of community and sense of fairness, et cetera, that they seem to have persisted into their adulthood. And I agree with you also that this feels like a time where nihilism seems to be the overwhelming perspective, right? We're in a failing empire. We are, the dollar is doomed. The world is coming to an end. And
Here's
the one.
here's
Go
an
ahead.
interesting way to think about it, Michael. In every turning, we are haunted by the fear that we're still living in the last turning. Right.
Mhm.
So during the American high, people don't, we think, oh, conventional culture, everything was kind of corny and no individualism. And you remember that people were still haunted by the fact that we might still be in a crisis. We were
Yeah.
arming ourselves to the teeth. We were all gathering the wagons. We conformed because we were still afraid. We were still afraid that we hadn't left behind that period of total war. And in fact, we went from fighting fascism to suddenly this very hot Cold War. I mean, China turned, and then the Soviets had the A bomb, then the H bomb. Remember the whole sequence of events. And it's interesting that during the awakening of the 60s, we still were afraid that we were living in the high, right? Institutions were hemming us in, preventing us from growing, taking away all our authenticity. I think in a way today, during this crisis, we don't even think that we're in a crisis. We still think we're in the unraveling, where everything is just sort of unraveling into pieces. And we don't see how the entire world is growing more tribal, more community oriented in that sense. I mean, this is internally, politically, but also internationally, it's growing more tribal. I mean, we see now clusters of nations all beginning to orient themselves around these different axes. This we called them during the 1930s. But in a way, we don't even recognize that we're living through this increasing grouping, or what I call tribalism, both within and among nations. We still think we're drifting into pieces. And it is interesting that we live each season afraid of the last season. And that's kind of what gives the dynamic motion. It's kind of like a difference engine. You're propelled through the current turning by the fact that you still are afraid of what you were in. Right.
So it's really interesting to me because in that context, right, that second derivative is effectively what you're referring to.
Exactly.
I absolutely get the same sense that we have come through a fairly significant portion of this, and I'm starting to see, the tribalism that I think in many ways that is frustrating to me, whether it's around crypto or whether it's around extreme political views. It is, a source of community for those who are part of it. And now it becomes an interesting question to me of, does one of those tribes emerge, or do others rotate to participate in that tribe? And so that's one of the things I wanted to hit on. But before we do that, we had a couple of poll questions, particularly in light of today's CPI. And, one of the terms that you use for the millennial generation that I think drives old men like Harley absolutely insane is the use of the description heroes as it relates to millennials. And so I just want, before you start to speak on this topic, I want to pull up our poll questions. I want to ask the question, can the millennials execute the turn? Can they go from being an entitled participatory generation to the hero generation that in your models leads us out of this? And so let's take a second just to see what the audience thinks. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll accept Harley's thoughts, and I will offer some of my own.
Well, I won't vote.
No, we're not allowed to. We're not allowed to vote. This is non-participatory in our stuff.
So when we're looking, Michael, at an archetype, you're looking at a type of generation, a sort of an archetype of a generation that has a characteristic path of development, right? It isn't just a thing for all time at all ages.
Yep.
No, that's not how it works. If you had looked at boomers back when they were, early wave boomers when they were just graduating from college. They looked like the most docile generation in the world. In fact, Pat Brown, I grew up in California, but Pat Brown had this famous quote in 1962. He said, these kids, they're going to go right into the system. All of our defense industries are going to be the most easy to handle generation. Never did a governor say anything so stupid, because about 18 months later was Mario Savio, the free speech movement, and suddenly we're not going to throw our bodies under the gears of the machine. You know what? And then all hell broke loose, right?
Yep.
That entire generation saw all of its best plans for building America, the Great Society, Vietnam, and everything just collapse into sex, drugs, rock and roll, crime, and everyone suddenly oriented toward self. That is not how boomers first appeared. And I would ask people to go back, and here's one problem with history. We always look at history as already having been settled, right? So we look back at Abraham Lincoln and we think, oh my God, this was this great man, this titanic man. This is the most unlikely leader in the world. He'd only served one term in Congress, not very successful one, and he was overwhelmed. Even his own cabinet didn't think much of him. He was called every bad name in the book. He expected to lose the election of 1864. His entire efforts would have been reversed by the Democrats winning. He barely managed to escape that, finally won the war, was assassinated, and then, of course, everyone thought of him as this great hero. That is not how anyone interpreted Abraham Lincoln at the time. Even radical Republicans in his own party didn't like him. But I'm going to ask something else for people to go back and think about. We talk about the greatest generation, and we think about everything, a Promethean generation, because they took America out of the Great Depression. They went into those WPA programs. They donned all those uniforms. They built all those trails and dams. Then they fought a war in which they conquered half the world, defeating fascism. Then they went on with the Cold War, and they built the interstate highways and the miracle vaccines. They took us to the moon. They had the Great Society. They had all this stuff. And then we kept on electing them. Even when they no longer ran Congress, we kept on electing them in the White House. There was Reagan. There was George Bush, George Bush Sr. An incredible generation. We look back and we think, okay, wow, they must have been that way in the very beginning. But let's go back and look at Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, as very young adults in maybe the late 1930s. America was still in the Great Depression. We still had double-digit unemployment. We still had deflation. 1940, I think, had the lowest long-term bond yield in history, going all the way up until, I don't know, post-GFC.
A couple of years ago, yeah.
Yeah. But the point is that that's where we were. And you looked at this generation, people worried about them. They were so protected. We had child labor laws for them. They all went to high school. Everyone knew that they had been much more protected than the earlier lost generation. They were kind of optimistic about the future with seemingly no basis in fact. They were all into sort of technological improvements, but they never had to do the really hard and gritty jobs that their parents had to do. And most of all, they were radical in the most unseemly ways. This is a generation that joined the Popular Front. Many of them joined the Communist Party. The Comintern dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism. I think that the recent movie Oppenheimer, I think actually threw an interesting, I don't know if you saw it, Michael.
I haven't seen it yet.
But it's an interesting movie because you suddenly realize that Oppenheimer in his circle, you had a lot of communists. Yep. I mean, that was sort of they were going down. This is as late as 1938, 1939. They were signing the Oxford Peace Pledge. And this was because they were haunted by the memory of World War I. And you remember, America was still absolutely, resolutely isolationist. We wouldn't even send arms to another country, like Britain or like China, without cash and carry. I mean, we just didn't want to participate. They were signing the Oxford Pledge, basically swearing never to serve in the armed forces because, you know, anything is more important than, you know, profiting the arms manufacturers and, you know, doing all the horrible things that we did in World War I. That same generation was the one that then, of course, conquered the world, saved democracy from fascism, you know, did all these things. And so what you have to do when you look at a generation is not look at the trends, the fads, and so on. You have to look at their underlying nature. And if you had looked at the underlying nature of the GI generation, you would have seen a hero generation in chrysalis. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because they did have that community orientation. They did have that long-term vision about the world they wanted to build. They were a left-brain generation of you know, builders and engineers. They did have a certain optimism, which in the long term was probably good for America, right? They weren't like boomers, you know, they weren't singing about death and destruction and, you know, how horrible everything was. They were kind of an upbeat group of people. And I think when you look at that, you begin to be very humble about your ability to look at a bunch of young people and predict what they would turn out to be. And that's what I try to do. And what Bill and I have always tried to do in our work is to look at archetypes as not being simply a generation is this, but a generation is a certain path of development.
Neil, are you, as you describe this cycle, is it a demographic cycle or a socioeconomic cycle?
It's a social and cultural cycle in the deepest sense. It's broadly.
It really wouldn't matter who's born. The cycle's going to happen no matter what. It's almost like you're preordained.
Well, the cycle works because of this. I mean, think of it this way. Generations are shaped young by history, right? As children and coming of age, that sort of shapes them, you know, and what they fear, what they value, what they get too much of, what they don't get enough of, whether they're very protectively raised, whether they're just throwaway kids, no one really cares about them. You know what I mean? That's how that shapes them. And then 40 years later, that generation shapes the history, which shapes the next group. So my thesis is that that creates a closed system. And out of that closed systems comes 4 distinct generations and 4 distinct moods that corresponds to each new generation coming of age and each generation moving up another age bracket, right? So everything that goes into shaping a generation, economically, socially, culturally, your attitudes toward your family, your peers, what success means to you in the economy, whether you value money more than, you know, reputation, all of these things. Particularly one very important cycle that we see is the cycle between protective versus unprotective nurture. I know, Michael, we've talked about that, and that certainly, yep, I think you'd admit, comes across in the book. Gen Xers were very underprotected, I think it's fair to say, the home alone generation. No one really cared too much about what was happening to them. They've grown up to value, you know, everything from reality TV to survival shows. And today, by the way, they are far and away. I don't know if you've seen the Siena, New York Times Siena polls. They are far and away the most pro-Trump age bracket in America today, 45 to 65. They're out there 15, 18 percentage points for Trump. And basically over much more so than older Americans, by the way, boomers, who are much more sort of, you know, 50-50. But that's an interesting generation. And it's very much, it contrasts very much with today's kids who are growing up. And I cite here, I talk about them in our book, but I cite here the great book by Jonathan Haidt that came out recently called The Anxious Generation, about the kids that Xers have raised who are overprotective, right? And that is the cycle, right? Underprotected parents, that is to say, parents who were underprotected in their youth, raise overprotected kids. And that's a cycle that goes way back, right? And we talk about that in generations. You remember when you go back centuries, but you can just see that all these Xers hovering over their kids. In fact, I go out and I talk to 14, 15, even 17-year-olds who tell me they can't remember a single time in their entire life when some adult did not know exactly where they were, right? That weren't actually looking at them or monitoring their exact position. I don't know about you, Michael, but those of us who are old, I can't even imagine growing up that way, right? Where do you get a sense of agency? Where can you fail? Where can, you know what I mean? And this leads to the anxiety felt by these kids. So, protectiveness is good, except when it's in excess, right? And then it can become problematic. In fact, it even can become pathological.
So Neil,
Well,
you're
it's definitely.
proposing
Go ahead, Harley.
you're like an 80-year social cycle through 4 turnings.
80 to 90 year social cycle, yes.
How do you compare that to a 60-year conjunctive cycle? Because he came about basically, 100 years before, 60 years before you, in the 20s and 30s. He kind of has a similar idea, but he was more financial, not social. I mean, is there an overlap there?
Yeah, actually, the Kondratiev cycle, is sort of hit by wars and things, and it's partly taking in Europe, it's partly taking in America. I think that the K-wave cycle that works for me is basically a 2-stroke cycle, which is more a 45-year cycle, which actually does work. And in fact, throughout our history, our second and fourth turnings economically are much more difficult than our first and third turnings, right? In other words, what we would call our, the American high and kind of the 90s were much better economically than, recently and say the 70s. But it's interesting how many of these cycles are out there. One of the most cycles which fits what we do best, actually, is the cycle of realigning elections. This is what political scientists always point out, that, once about every 40 years, we have a great realigning elections. Those have always occurred during awakenings or crises. And in fact, I think we just had our realigning election. Or elections, it's usually one confirmed by another, like 1932 confirmed by 1936 with FDR and the New Deal coalition. But I think we had it in 2016 and 2020, where you had this recomposition of the two parties, right? Working class, non-college went from the Democratic Party to the Republican, and your suburban college went the opposite direction. And I've noticed that in the new political science textbooks, they're beginning to talk about the 7th realigning election in America, which is this most recent realignment. The earlier one was the 1970s with the Southern strategy, right? When Southern, Democrats voted Republican. Earlier it was the New Deal. Earlier it was McKinley. Earlier was the Civil War. I mean, it just goes back. It's like every 2 turnings, we have a realignment. We have had a realignment this cycle. What we have not seen this cycle is a clear winner from the realignment, but history tells us that usually appears.
Have you ever considered the fact, we'll call yours the H wave versus a K wave, that when the K and H both peak at the same time, you'll get a larger, and if they're at one's peaking, one's bottoming, you'll get a softer kind of muting. Is there? I mean, if you have a 6-year cycle and an 8-year cycle, at some point they're going to double top and double bottom.
I look a lot at economic cycles. Obviously, looking at 3-year, 10-year, 20-year cycles. You look at these different kind of cycles, and or cycles of R&D. Technological invention, like Carlotta Perez. She has her long-term sort of innovation and build-out cycle. And one of the things you often ask about this cycle is what determines their periodicity. You're just dealing with a lot of technology out there. What would give it a period? Why not 200? Why not 200 years? Why not 84? I mean, one thing that I like about a generational cycle is it has a built-in periodicity. It has a built-in governor, right? It has to do with aging, right? Every generation ages. We go through phases of life. And in fact, as those phases of life dilate, expand, or contract, that actually influences the total timing of the cycle. And and this is what I often look for in a persuasive cycle theory. I think it needs to have at least some implied governor, causal governor of what would give it a periodicity. Generational aging is one, because we all age through recognized phases of life. I mean, there's a phase of life when you're expected to be a child. There's a phase of life when you're expected to be a leader. And of course, recently, when I talk about dilation, I'm talking about people who are much older than we've usually experienced becoming senior leaders. And there's a lot of talk about that today in the media.
I presume you're not so weird to think that only the West has a cycle. I presume China and Russia have cycles also. Have you ever examined them?
So I talk about this in the book, and I will say that's one thing that I do in the most recent book that we did not do. We did some, but we did not do much of in our 1997 book. And let's talk about where the cycle started, and more it's what gave it its impulsive power, and why it's becoming global, why the cycle is becoming global. Think of this: the Great Depression, World War II were global events. I mean, it does not only the entire English-speaking world, but all of Europe, certainly Russia, South Asia, East Asia, China, Japan, India had its revolution. I mean, we're talking about most of the world, right? When you talk,
Germany was on the bottom of that cycle, wasn't it?
Excuse me?
I assume Germany is on the bottom of that cycle.
Well, it went through a crisis. I mean, it went through a crisis and it came out refashioned. Now, interestingly, it may not matter whether or not you win or lose the crisis. I don't know if you remember, Mansur Olson had that famous book called The Rise and Decline of Nations. He tried to explain why Germany and Japan did so well after World War II. He said because the crisis completely forced them to recreate all their institutions from scratch, get rid of all the barnacles, get rid of all the sinecures, right? It actually, so every crisis does that. Win or lose, you've got to rebuild institutions from scratch. This is the creative destruction part of the fourth turning that we have already started, and remains some of it in this cycle. But to go back to how the cycle is created, it is part of what it means to live in the modern world. To have a generational cycle, you must in some essential way be modern. What does it mean to be modern? It means that you have a sense of progress. And it could be because this really started with monotheistic religion. It probably was accentuated by the Reformation, the Renaissance, technology, certainly by the French Revolution. But you saw in the West, probably coming out of probably the Reformation and Renaissance, a real notion that history is linear and could yield progress. What that does is then orient every generation to think, well, where do they stand in that progress? And makes every generation of leaders want to devise different strategies of progressing. And that leads to a cycle. When you have a completely traditional society where, fathers do exactly what their grandfathers did and their great-grandfathers did, if there's nothing better than you could do as a warrior than be like Achilles, you know what I mean? There's no real sense of generational development. Generations developed precisely when there was a sense of progress. And that actually leads to one of the paradoxes as we spell out these turnings, is that the cycle arises in social moods precisely when we think that history is linear. I mean, come on, Michael, that's a little bit of a paradox, right? It's exactly when we think we're on this path. And in fact, it was just at the time of the French Revolution when suddenly we were intoxicated by the idea that humanity could improve, that suddenly we began to talk about generations. Oh, I came of age before the French Revolution. Well, that means, you're ancien regime, you're kind of old fashioned. I came of age after it. And we all began to think of ourselves where we stood in relationship to that progress. That gives rise to the cycle. And it started in the West, but it's gradually encompassed more of the rest of the world. And there's a place, I believe that's in chapter 5, where I kind of go through how, particularly in the 19th century, more and more of the rest of the world, starting with China and South America and so on, began to be part of this cycle. Certainly, the Great Depression, World War II, was a fourth turning for the world. And then about 40 years later, we had an awakening of young people around the world. It wasn't just in Berkeley and Columbia. It was Paris 68. It was the Baader-Meinhof gang. It was Euro terrorism in Europe. It was Tokyo. It was Mexico City, where the troops came out and, gunned down hundreds of college kids. It was around the world during the 1970s. And we had a global awakening, and these were all kids born after the crisis. This wasn't just in America. I think that the Anglo-American experience is probably the longest case study in it, but I think it's absolutely, you look at these more ethnocentric populist leaders in charge in East Asia today, the Narendra Modis and the Xi Jinping, just all of these people, they're all born after World War II. They're all of their generation, and they're all pulling the world in the same direction.
So we have a
So
global,
one of the things,
yes, it's global.
yeah,
not completely global. Again, I think, to look at, I think the Muslim world is a slightly different timing for reasons I point out in the book. And Sub-Saharan Africa, it's kind of hard to say because in many ways they remain traditional. But I think, for people who think about sort of the economically relevant part of the world, yes, I think you can say that it's global.
So one of the things that I think happens, and this is very much true for how I at least initially read your book around the turning cycles, is exactly as Harley alluded to, linking to the Kondratiev wave, this idea of investment cycles. Carlota Perez would say something very similar. And so I think immediately people looked at the fourth turning and the context of it and said, okay, 1929 crash. And so in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis, it felt very prescriptive. And then you had a period basically until 2020 that felt a little surreal, but I think most people kind of, buckled down and said, okay, that, we can kind of ignore that nonsense, and then bam, COVID hits, right? I also think your point is super interesting. Harley, one of the, inspirations that Neil has for this is the Polybius cycle, one of the more interesting contemporary writers, I would joke, who is the source of the expression, hard times make hard men, hard men make good times make weak men, it's weak men make hard times, right? And
go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, and so the point that I would emphasize is that the two tend to have an overlap to them because there is a fundamental restructuring of institutions, and one of the best ways to change institutions is, of course, to withdraw their funding, right? We've certainly seen that within the churches. We're certainly starting to see that within the educational institutions. We're seeing this behavior across our society. I see within my generation, and perhaps those who are a few years older than me, I'm blessed to have a brother who's 17 years older than I am. I see a tremendous amount of cynicism that we can come out of this in any way, shape, or form, right? I think it gives rise to a nihilism in which people weirdly are willing to outsource the experience that they have to the market, right? And this has been one of the weirder experiences of my life as I have transitioned from very much a hardcore free market advocate to recognizing that none of the markets that I have participated in have ever been free. They've always had guiding principles to them. And I like to use the example, people talk about them as markets, and I'm like, it's much more like an aquarium, right? You have to maintain and invest in managing that process in order to have a viable environment for success. And so as I look at this, I very much am trying to change the focus away from the purely financial components to increasingly the political cycles and the institutions that are beginning to emerge around that. But at the same time, there are some really unique components to this cycle. And I just want to pause for 2 seconds to ask our second question now, which is on the subject of inflation, because I think a lot of people looked at the inflationary experience of 2021 and 2022 and said, here's the crisis, right? The dollar is going to collapse. We're going to be paying $7,000 for a bottle of milk in a short period of time. The system will fall. And of course, Bitcoin fixes this. Let's put up our second question.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
For me to respond to, is your question, what is the crisis? It sounds like that's what your question is.
Well, what I want to do is I want to hit on a couple of components around that, and then I want to come back to asking you, is that the crisis? Because my sense is no, but I'm much more interested in your perspective as the knowledgeable guest than my going on. So let's make sure we get to this question though, because this is going to be our moment of levity. Why was Harley so wrong? Why was Harley so wrong on inflation? Was he ideologically inflationist? Was he simply promoting PFIX? Or that inflation's coming back, just you wait, Mike Green.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah.
I'm gonna defend Harley on this one in a weird way.
Okay.
I am.
Well,
First of all,
wait until we get our responses, Neil. But now you've skewed the results, and so regardless of how they come back, we can discard them. Ah, look at that. Just you wait, Henry Higgins.
I think
Just you wait.
Steve Trance has one good number. He's so happy.
No, it's not one good number, Harley. All right. Let's go. I want to hear your answer to this, Neil, because I think my response may actually surprise you as well. But
okay, I want to answer the general question about crisis and all that, and then talk about inflation.
Yes.
The general issue, when I talk about crisis, I'm talking about a crisis era. So that lasts an entire generation. That could be 21 to 24, even 25 years long. In other words, it's a whole generation, right? And we don't think this one's going to come to a close probably until 2032 or something like that. I mean, that's going to be the resolution. So that's a crisis. It's not like the Hindenburg goes down. We're not talking about one day, right, or what I mean. So this
only if it was manufactured by Boeing, but yes, it's
well, then it's just a predictable event. It's not even
exactly. It's not a crisis. It's an expected return.
There we go. So that's that. But I do talk about a crisis era having a morphology, and I talk about the precursor, the catalyst, these periods of regeneracy when we become increasingly tribal and we kind of redefine our tribes. And then finally, the consolidation when we recognize the fate of our country is at stake. And then ultimately the climax, right? And that's what really reshapes, right? That takes place usually, not always, but usually near the end of the crisis era, right? And then it finally is a resolution. That's when all the treaties are signed and all the agreements are formed, and all the wet concrete suddenly turns solid. You know what I mean? We reshape everything really busily, and then suddenly it's a new structure, very different than what we had when we entered it. So just terminology, right? One's a crisis era, the other is a climax, right? And the climax is when things are reshaped most suddenly. Now, and by the way, I will say one more thing about crisis, and that is what does the reshaping? And that kind of renders a lot of things secondary. Fundamentally, what does the reshaping? Talk about this in detail in the book, so I don't want to, organize conflict. Always.
Yeah.
Always. It's either internal or external. One or the other. It always happens every fourth term, right? And we don't like to hear that because obviously, total war, people don't like to talk about that, or internal war. But no one likes to talk about this. But it is, if you want to look at what is the incubator for community, and every sociologist will tell you this, the incubator for community is conflict, right? It always has been, it always will be. That's when everyone has to pull together. We relearn everything that we really do absolutely depend on each other because the adrenaline is there. My life's at stake, your life's at stake, the very future of our community is at stake. If you want to know why America was such a community-oriented society during the American High, the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy, you can't explain that without talking about how we just went through World War II. I mean, you understand what I mean by that. And you 100%. Can go back in these early areas as well. Now, will it be internal and external? And how one often leads to the other is absolutely fascinating. I do spend a lot of the book talking about that. almost every time we have an internal conflict, it almost inevitably leads to external, because if you're on the losing side of an internal conflict, you always want to draw in allies from abroad. We won the American Revolution because we pulled in the French. Well, we made an internal conflict external, right? And if it hadn't been for the French, we wouldn't have won it. I mean, not just the Battle of Yorktown, but suddenly Britain had to deal with France all over the world. It just suddenly made a truce. What did the South do when it was losing? Well,
tried to bring in France.
Britain and France. I believe they were one big battlefield victory away from getting Palmerston and Britain on their side. If Lee had won the Battle of Antietam, that was critical. That was before the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation. Once Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, it was kind of all over, because now Europe really couldn't come in on the southern side. But that was their window of opportunity. They missed it. But it's interesting to go back and look. There's always an international dimension to internal, and similarly, I don't want to go through all the examples, but there's always a internal dimension to external.
Yep.
And I think, but if you go back to what I was talking about earlier, what would the GI generation have looked like back in 1938 or 1939? If you had gone out on the street and done a poll of Americans in, say, 1939, you say, look, there's going to be a huge conflict in a few years from now, let's say 3. What's it going to be about? I think most Americans would have said, remember, we were totally isolationist at that point. We just said it's going to be between fascism and communism. I mean, remember at that point, Michael, no one believed that liberal democracy had a future. It was either we were going toward, one model or another. That was the mood at the time. And the New Deal so polarized America. We were incredibly polarized and tribal during that decade. And in many countries, obviously, and particularly in Europe, it brought dictatorships. I mean, throughout much of Central and Eastern Europe. So
one of the books I recommend to people all the time is a book called The Three New Deals, right? And it is actually about the fact that there was not one New Deal, there were multiple New Deals throughout the world. We saw it in China, you saw it in Japan, you saw it in Germany, etc., where there was a radical reinvention of society, because the traditional society, right, to use your term, right, the traditional framework simply didn't work in an industrial era.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was thought at the time that you needed top-down dictatorship, when a lot of people called FDR a dictator. After the first New Deal in America was the first 100 days. I mean, famously, a lot of people called him a dictator, but not always as criticism. Many people thought, thank you. You're the new Mussolini. It's what we need now. Now, this is the Mussolini of 1932, not the Mussolini of 1942. You know what I mean?
Right.
So he was seen with optimism and hope. But I want to come back to this. We see history from the rear, looking back. We never see how it looks at the time.
Well, this is part of what I try to remind people about the history, the counterculture history that emerged in the late 1960s, right? Chomsky's manufactured consent, et cetera. What they were was a scream against the propaganda of exactly what you're describing, the inevitable progress of American society that was reinstated as a historical fact post-World War II victory, right? Going into World War II. People forget that even though America was clearly the manufacturing engine for the world, not the vast majority, but a large fraction of the American populace thought there was no chance that the United States could actually win that type of war, given the struggles and challenges that we were facing at home. Right? As you point out, there was an incredible growth of registration of the Communist Party. There was an incredible move in terms of general anarchism, et cetera, and resistance to the traditional.
There was also the feeling among the dictatorships that, America was very rich. They had these huge mass production things. I mean, Ford was almost a saint in the Soviet Union. Everyone worshipped Ford, because
not almost. In both Germany and in the Soviet Union, he was absolutely perceived as the technologist, right?
But here was the problem. They thought, yeah, all those things about America are really interesting, but they're fundamentally decadent, they're fundamentally hedonistic, and they have no will, right? I mean, they're soft. Just look at those Americans. I mean, so all of the dictatorships basically discounted America. Would Germany have declared war on America? I'd be probably the most imbecilic decision in probably the last several centuries is, declaring war on America after Pearl Harbor. I mean, what was going through their minds, right? Oh, they just thought it was irrelevant. Mussolini actually was quoted as saying, "The entry of America into the war leaves me utterly,
unimpressed."
unfazed." Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Utterly unimpressed. Well, they all thought, and by the way, Japan felt that America had such little will that all they had to do was make these islands, very costly to take. Their whole strategy was basically, they knew they couldn't win the war, but just make it so costly that we would have to negotiate terms, right? That was their strategy. They did not realize what happens when a soft, decadent democracy, and I think Americans today don't realize that. That's why I'm emphasizing it. A soft, decadent democracy suddenly decides to act as a single organism. It is an unbelievable, stunning thing. And it is much more impressive in its response than a autocratic society where you have to constantly scream at people to do things, because now you've got everyone voluntarily joining in to do it, right? And that's an amazing thing to watch. It is, I think, our future, or I'm hopeful that that's our future. And it is one of those processes we go through in the fourth turning. That's what makes this era that we're living through, I think, going to turn out to be so fascinating to witness.
Neil,
Well, go ahead, Harley.
I was going to say, this is an investment show of some sorts.
Exactly.
I was going to get back to inflation. Harley, I didn't get back to inflation.
Inflation. Go get back a good kick, okay, for me?
So in this movement toward tribalism and community, which ultimately in the climax will involve the mobilization of the entire country, right? That always involves inflation. Always, every fourth turning, it climaxes in inflation. Why? Because inflation is just one of several different means of burden sharing. It's as simple as that, right? So what do? Well, you can tax, you can sell bonds, and you can inflate. And that troika is what governments do every single time, going back, by the way, to the War of Spanish Succession. I mean, that goes back way back in the past. I'm talking about the 17th century. Late 17th century. But my point is that inflation works. And by the way, one of the reasons I think we are so sure to have inflation is that we already have a debt burden even before the climax, which equals what we were in the last fourth turning after the climax, right, Michael? We're at about, 100% of GDP, give or take, on publicly held national debt.
And we're almost at exactly the same levels that we were after World War II. I definitely want to push back on some components of this, but yes.
I don't want to say, but it's not just where we are in terms of debt, it's on our trajectory. I mean, if you look at, we're planning to actually decrease discretionary spending as a share of GDP, but we have all this autopilot spending that's worked in there. Well, we're not going to decrease. In a fourth turning, we're not going to decrease discretionary spending as a share of GDP. We're going to massively increase it. We're probably going to have to pare back on entitlement programs. I think we're going to have, I think we're going to have capitated healthcare. You know what I mean? We're going to have a very different kind of entitlement. But even with all that, we're going to have a huge burden to spread. And one way we're going to spread it is through inflation and through financial repression. The two of them always
So
go
you
together.
really
In other
only
words,
have two ways
not
of doing.
only am I going to inflate your bonds, but I'm going to force you to hold them. And if you're a financial institution, I'm going to force you to buy more of them. And that's exactly what we did during World War II.
Well, inflation is a tax. So
inflation is a tax when it's conducted in the form of seigniorage, right? If you bring back in the coin, you debase the coin and you re-release it, absolutely it's a tax. Somebody gives you an ounce of gold, you give them back 15/16 of an ounce of gold. That is absolutely a tax.
But I'm talking about inflation with financial repression. It means you got to hold those bonds and you got to buy more of them.
So this is the thing that I think is actually really interesting, right? The reason why you have inflation in those periods is inflation is not a method for solving the problem per se, but it's a method of devaluing the claims that the prior generation has and freeing up
the problem. That's the problem you're solving.
So the point that I'm making around that, though, is that that's not actually solving the government indebtedness per se. What it's reducing is a claim that exists, and we're absolutely going to see this. I completely agree with you. The entitlements will be cut; they will be restricted. It's already embedded within the code language for Social Security and Medicare to experience cuts, as those are no longer funded. Once you hit that point, we are supposed to cut them back, as we did, by the way, in the 1980s. This is not unprecedented in terms of the reforms around it, as we also did in 1996 by changing the calculation of inflation for cost of living allowances that allowed them to become far too large at that point. So I just want to be very clear. I'm not pushing back on the idea that inflation is absolutely going to play a role here. In fact, what I think is most likely is that we have retreated in this inflation framework. And I just want to highlight that there are two very different reasons why inflation can happen. Inflation can happen because there is exactly the sort of political crisis that you're describing. And then there's also a very fundamental inflation. There's a fantastic paper by the Dallas Fed that actually hits on elements of this, just released a couple of days ago, which is inflation that's tied to population growth. And so the inflation of the 1960s and 1970s wasn't that devaluing of claims. There was none of that radical change that you're referring to in the destruction of institutions, even though the boomers certainly rose up and presented an alternative view. But what you did absolutely see in that time period was a global phenomenon where we had to accommodate an unprecedented growth in population, just something like we had never actually seen before. I actually have a chart to show that point. Give me 1 second to pull it up here. It should be right here.
Mike, are we going to go mark this day down as like the mea culpa on your part? You're finally giving up
No,
on inflation?
no. I actually, like, that's actually part of the challenge is that you have misinterpreted.
Neil here to go defend you, and he stabbed you in the back. Oh, Neil, thank you.
No, that's not what happened. But that's okay.
I wanted to agree with you, Michael, that devaluing the claims of older generations is exactly what you have to do in a crisis to make room for resources.
100%. Absolutely correct.
And
so I want you guys to actually see this chart, because this is the primary reason why I've pushed back against the model of inflation that people have pushed so far this cycle. Right? The idea that there is an emergent shortage in the absence of the crisis that Neil is referring to seems highly, highly unlikely. The unique thing about the 20th century was its inflationary characteristics, and it was tied to a very fundamental dynamic. Massive, massive population growth in a manner that the world had never seen before, that demanded resources, et cetera. Now we're coming out the other side of that. But the problem this time is one much more like what Neil is describing. It's a generational conflict, because the claims on the assets that are being hoarded by the boomer generation and even the silent generation ahead of them, is just extraordinary, right? It's basically the get off my lawn kids sort of framework, where people are unwilling to give up what they believe they have rightfully worked for. They view it in the same framework that I would argue has persisted in many ways since the 1980s, roughly matching Neil's saeculum type framework. But it's I built this, I earned it, it's mine, right?
Mike, this has nothing to do with interest rates. I mean, you
Absolutely, it has everything to do with interest rates.
Does it? Pull up Michael Hartnett's 5,000-year chart of interest rates. It doesn't look like this at all.
That's because there are two different components of interest rates. Interest rates can be a function of scarcity. I'm unwilling to lend you resources because if I do, I'll starve to death. And there's a secondary component, which is you need capital deepening in order to maintain a capital labor ratio. When you have explosive growth in population, you're going to see your capital labor ratio fall. Therefore, you need additional capital investment. The Fed's response to the 1970s
anymore. Neil, 3 questions for you.
We certainly
need cycles.
We
you believe
certainly
cycles, Neil.
We certainly
hold on 1 second. Let Neil finish.
We certainly needed capital broadening through the 1970s and 80s. Not only boomers coming in, but women coming in huge numbers.
100%.
Enormous growth in the workforce. No longer, Michael. And in fact,
I agree.
Here's an interesting statistic. This comes from the UN data, by the way, which are just updated today. If you want to look, Thursday, UN Population Division, they have the new numbers just went up.
Wait, before you say it, I'm going to guess they're down.
Well, since I've only been out for like 2 hours, I haven't, fully delved into them yet. But I will say this, just looking at the UN numbers, and that the growth in the working age population is slowing down to such an extent that if you look at the entire high income world plus the entire emerging market world, so that includes India, China, all the usual suspects, Brazil and all the rest, that entire working age population will stop growing and begin to decline slightly by 2027, 2028. That is amazing. And by the way, Michael, that's the first time since Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776, completely predicated on a constantly expanding population, which has been responsible for roughly half of GDP growth over time, give or take. But that's been approximately true over time. That's going to be gone. And we have not really thought about that. No capital deepening in that world, Michael. You look at how many Southern European countries, they're actually beginning to be terrified of what to do with their empty homes. So I should say no capital broadening in those societies. There will be capital deepening. This is a very different world for the determination of interest rates, very different environment for inflation. However, when it comes to mobilization for civic survival, all other rules are off. That will lead to inflation. And that is simply an alternative means of burden sharing. I think we agree on that.
Neil, 3 questions here. So as the clock's ticking away here, you believe in cycles, clearly. Do you believe in Elliott wave or Fibonacci cycles for trading, which is more short-term than a 30-year cycle? Without hurting yourself too much, can your cycles make some kind of prediction about whether it'll be a Republican or Democrat? Because we don't know who it's going to be yet for the election. It could be, we have no idea. Do your cycles predict at all Republican or Democrat? And number 3 is, are you willing to go and predict something about, will there be an internal-external conflict of significance between now and 2032?
All right, that's a lot of questions. So let me try to answer them in reverse order. Republican versus Democrat? No. And in fact, the best compliment that has been paid to me by many readers of The Fourth Turning is here, is that they can read the entire book, which is all about these kinds of conflicts, tribalism, polarization, all the rest. And by the end of the book, they still don't know who I vote for. I actually consider that a compliment, Michael, because
it's huge compliment. It's huge compliment.
That is not, and I talk about Trump and Biden, I talk about but it is, my focus is not on who I side with. My focus is what's going to happen. Okay. Now, which side is going to win? I don't know. And what I usually point out is that one side does win. So you have basically one party becomes the sun, the other becomes the moon. I mean, that's kind of, that's what happened in the 1930s. The Democratic Party became the sun and the Republican was this little moon party, they got reflected light. But at the same time, that transforms both parties because the dominant party has to come to terms with the other party, right? So we become a different country. We become a more cohesive country, but the idea of which side nominally wins is really not the focus. Your other point was, remind me of, I'm trying to go back.
Fibonacci or Elliott waves. Do you believe in them?
Okay, Fibonacci. So, I've looked at that. I think, I'll be honest with you. My opinion, looking at, Elliott waves and so on is a testimony to humanity's ability to see patterns in anything. I've tried to identify them. I've looked at, random things, and I say, it all kind of depends. In other words, if someone could actually give me an algorithm whereby I could put it into, machine learning and actually just, I could objectively determine what those are and I could test it, then great. But I've never seen any. If you know somebody who does that, I can just take any piece of random data and actually identify which of the, are we on the up 5 or the down 5? You know what I mean? Then great, I would implement it, but I'm not going to trust my own pattern recognition on that. Okay, your next question was?
Will there be, I mean, can you talk about yes or no? Will there be a significant internal external event between now and 2032, or are we already in it right now?
Here's the thing. I cannot predict whether it will be internal or external for a reason that I discuss at actually pretty great length in the book. And I actually had a long discussion of that because it's amazing how there's a razor edge. You remember when I talk about the late 30s, how we all would have thought it would have been, New Deal against its enemies, finally breaking out. Well, it did break out in violence. We had, sit down strikes and Pinkertons, and we did have violence in America.
Bonus army, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. But we did not end up suddenly, we were all united against foreign powers half the world away. Well, how did that happen? What I maintain is that it's a greater and greater potential energy for community against another. But what the other is remarkably undetermined until a late instance. And sometimes we move between the other being an outsider versus an insider. An interesting case is the American Revolution, where in the late 70s, it was, the Patriots against the Tories, and the Tories were regarded as an outsider. Most of the deaths in the American Revolution were Americans killing other Americans, by the way. It wasn't killing British, but they were regarded as an outside other. The next big climax, however, which occurred later, was the battle over the Constitution. And that was definitely an internal struggle. And it followed, by the way, the most depressed economic a decade in American history, the 1780s. The 1780s shows a decline in income per capita that actually exceeds the Great Depression. It was horrible. People are actually moving out of cities. All the Tories who actually ran everything, like the business leaders and the accountants, they all left. And all the harbours are wrecked. All the fields were, it was a horrible time. And there's some good books that have just come out, by the way, one called The Quartet, on the Constitutional Convention, what led to it, but the feeling of terrible crisis and how these independent states were just going to fly into smithereens is something we don't talk about in our history as much. We always think about the fight against the British. We never talk about how unlikely it was that we were ever going to come together into one country. Remember, the Declaration of Independence says we are free and independent states, S at the end. How did we ever become a nation? That is something we don't talk about as much.
We don't talk about it, and unfortunately we are running out of time. So I wanted to do basically what Harley did and run you through 60-second answers to questions here, right? So one of your big fans, Cindy, asks, given that some time has passed since the book came out, when would you say the ekpyrosis will happen? Ekpyrosis. And do you think we'll have a civil war given the state of politics, or I would ask the question, do you think the external conflict is going to be enough?
It's usually either or. So it will be external or internal. It may involve a little bit of both. I still don't have an opinion. Just look at how, what people are thinking about with regard to November 5th coming up, and look at how divided our country is. It is scary to me. this new Supreme Court decision on immunity, it's as though we, whoever comes into Washington, the other side will mount a resistance, kind of like the Germans came into Paris. You know what I mean? This scares
No,
me.
I know exactly what you mean. And we just highlight that if you do a Google search on the emergence of the phrase #resist, it almost perfectly mirrors the layout of the Civil War. Let me jump to the second one. Can our society's cycle translate up into our country's cycle? In other words, is this the US in decline?
No, I am very hopeful. Now, I can't tell. There are fourth turnings that end very badly. We all know of countries that go through these. Look at what happened to Russia, from World War I to the end of World War II, 35 million. I mean, unnatural deaths. Let me put it that way. But, horrible. So horrible things can happen in fourth turnings. Historically, fourth turnings have usually come out well for America. I'm optimistic about this one, but here's the thing I want to emphasize. Fourth turnings are times when by the time we get to the end of it, we actually rejuvenate our institutions. We render ourselves institutionally young again, and we defy entropy. And I think we're overwhelmed by entropy today. We just think that everything, the energy drains out of everything. Everything becomes more complicated, and more indecipherable, more meaningless. We're all lonelier. We're more disconnected. This all reverses. And there are times in history when it reverses. History is not gradual. History goes through periods of punctuated
equilibrium. It's like evolution.
Equilibrium.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see here. Adrian, very smart guy out of Canada. I'm not sure how optimistic Neil is on the future, but I think we're going to see tremendous breakthroughs in many fields, from progress in electrons to atoms, and it makes me bullish on the US. Would you echo that? How does the role of technology facilitate the creation of those new institutions and that rebirth?
The climax of the crisis always catapults technology. Just think of we went from the World's Fair of 39, where all these things were just ideas, but the younger generation looking forward, and look at how many of those things we implemented in the high that followed. I think when millennials become the generation in charge, Michael, they will be highly oriented around kind of left brain engineering of the outer world, so that we all live a better life, and particularly reorganizing our communities, the external infrastructure of how we live together. Not so much, our individual devices, you know what I mean? Which I think what boomers and Xers have done so much, individual consumption. Millennials are really going to focus on how we live together as communities. I will hate it. A boomer, I will just chafe under that world. I won't like it, but it will be what society needs, and it is where we're going.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's a couple of minutes skip. One of the questions coming in from Joseph Zanoli. So the investment conclusion here is to be long hard assets and ride the transferatory inflation wave going forward. Now, I'll tell you my answer to that is probably not, partly because of the chart that I put up before. I think that there's a very real risk that hard assets, or many types of hard assets, actually get devalued in very real terms versus the value of human labor in particular. But I'm interested in your response.
Well, unfortunately, for the last 150 years, you can't own human labor. That's a problem, Mike. But it is no question about it. Wages for any other kind of income hugely rose, in the late 1930s, and particularly during World War II. But that's a good thing, right? I mean, that will lead to equality of income, equality of wealth. I do think, however, that if you're thinking about wealth, things you can own, I do think obviously get out of nominally denominated assets. That's kind of an obvious. And I would say publicly held equity may also be a disadvantage. It's more easily regulated. Going into more alternative or privately held assets, particularly ones that do involve commodities. One thing that typically happens in a fourth turning is the world tends to fissure into different zones, like the Japanese prosperity sphere and so on. And I think that's in that environment, particularly when people are trying to build things again. You know what I mean? Yeah, you need to build weapons, you need to build structures, you need to build, trenches, and you need to build things. And in that world, I think some of the most unsexy parts of the S&P 500, like think about materials. I mean, what's the PE on materials? I think they always lag the rest of the S&P, right? But that actually might become interesting. Needless to say, things like defense and things involving building stuff that communities need at scale, those kinds of companies will be at a premium, and they will be force-fed by governments, by the public sector.
Yeah, and my caution there is that I think ultimately what you're describing is correct, that those resources will be used for rebuilding, but remember that we are talking about an increasingly collectivist society, and so the returns associated with owning those assets could actually be quite restricted, right? Again, this idea of financial repression that you highlight.
They could be restricted, but they'll do better than other stuff.
Okay, and then the last question is coming from Chris Johnson. Declining population, while global debt expands, opposing forces on inflation and interest rates. However, if the solution is political, doesn't inflation have to win out until debt is right-sized, whatever that level is?
You know, we're in a world of financial repression, which is basically government diktat. It's going to be very difficult to know this stuff. And one thing I would say as a warning, particularly at climax of the fourth turning, everything is overridden by government. You know, a government's going to come in and maybe buy the SPY, you know, buy the S&P 500, just as they were about to do. You remember during the pandemic. In the extreme, I mean, government will do anything just to prevent you from getting the market price. And
I think ultimately that's, yeah, I think that's actually correct. I completely agree with that. It's part of the reason why I warned people that I think what actually comes first is a deflationary episode associated with the truly bizarre behavior that we've had on interest rate policy over the last 2 years, followed by everything that you're talking about. Because ultimately we are going to find that monetary policy has been the cheat code that has allowed us to ignore many of these challenges up to this point. It's not the solution.
And central banks will be used for
100%.
Credit allocation, not just setting of interest rates. And when you're allocating credit, no one's going to care about interest rates. You know, I got
absolutely.
My loan, you know, so.
Yeah, I just want to remind people that DuPont went into the 1930s with a global monopoly on aluminum and came out without it. So you know, these things change very rapidly Michael, and very unexpectedly.
An interesting statistic on World War II. By the end of World War II, on VJ Day, the United States owned 60% of the capital of America's manufacturing companies.
Yep.
It's absolutely amazing. It was all funded by the government. They went into Ford, they went into General Motors, turn your entire assembly line into making tanks or Jeeps or ships. We'll pay for it directly. And so
right. But we will do so at a fixed rate of return. So it's like there's plenty of profiteering that can occur. But
totally. Yeah, administered prices. And then you won't know the real price until after price controls are lifted after the conflict.
I think that's absolutely correct. Okay, Neil, you have always just blown me away with your depth of knowledge on this. It's, you know, unfortunately, it's an area where you totally outclass me. That's, you know, that's so much easier than outclassing Harley, by the way. But it's, anyway, Neil, this was fantastic. The audience engagement was fantastic as well. I'm sorry we kept everyone late. I hope you think it was very worthwhile. Chris, I'm going to hand it back over to you to wrap up. And Neil, I look forward to catching up with you soon.
That'd be great, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Neil, very enlightening conversation. Thanks for joining us today. Before I let everybody go, just want to remind you our next KISS event will be on August 8th with former Fed staffer and founder of QI Research, Danielle DiMartino Booth. If you want any more information on Simplify or Simplify ETFs, please visit our website at www.simplify.us. or send us questions at info@simplify.us. Until then, we'll see you in August. Thank you, guys.